So yeah, quite a few of you may or may not be aware of, what the 12-step program is. Some of you, this isn't your first, I suppose, your first rodeo. And some of you, there's quite a few members on the group that obviously have their loved ones in treatment for the first time. So what I thought I would do is, because often you're going to hear like in conjoints or, on phone calls with your loved ones and your family members, they're going to talk about the 12 steps. They're going to talk about the 5 pillars and what they need to do in order to stay clean and sober. And I know that it can be quite, I don't want to say intimidating, but it can be a lot of information for someone to take in, if you obviously don't know what it is or how it works. So what we're going to do is I've kind of put together some presentation just to kind of run through what are the 12 steps firstly, and then the 5 pillars that we often talk about. And these are part of the toolbox that we equip your loved ones with, to work on their recovery once they leave treatment with us. So yeah, I'm just going to go into a brief history. So the 12-step programs are mutual aid organizations for the purpose of recovery from substance addictions, behavioral addictions, and compulsions. And the reason I say that, it's not just the substance addictions, but they are what we call process addictions that come up, in your loved one's life, or may come up in your loved one's life that they may need, some kind of assistance with. So if we look at the 12 steps, it was developed in the 1930s, which obviously the first 12-step program that was developed was Alcoholics Anonymous. This was founded by a gentleman by the name of Bill W., and he founded this with a doctor. And they came up with these 12 steps to obviously help people overcome alcoholism and overcome drinking. Obviously, back in the 1930s, they didn't have things like rehabs. They didn't have things like, there was only really lock-up psychiatric institutions. There was no such thing as like 12-step programs. So they came up, through Bill W.'s own experiences, he came up with these 12 steps to obviously help someone to, recover from alcoholism. And this program is aided in membership to overcome alcoholism. Since that time, dozens of other organizations have been derived from AA's approach to address problems as varied as drug addiction, compulsive gambling, and overeating. The 12 steps is one of the most proven ways of helping someone to recover from active addiction or alcoholism or any form of compulsive behavior that your loved ones may be experiencing. And I'll get more into that when I go into the meetings part of the presentation. But the 12 steps is one of the most effective or proven most effective ways for someone to recover from an addiction, because it's been around for a very long time. 12-step programs utilize a version of AA's suggested 12 steps, which were first published in 1939. So they developed a book called what we call the Big Book, and it's the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. We do sell them at the treatment center, and your loved ones can purchase them at meetings. But basically, it's basically the story or the book on how to, you can run through the 12 steps in that book, and it's also got stories from people that are recovering from alcoholism. So when we look at the process, it involves the following: admitting that one cannot control one's alcoholism, addiction, or compulsion. This is very, very crucial. And I know that we have struggled with this in primary quite a lot, is that there's a lot of denial when they come into primary care. So they might not come in willingly. They come in believing that they're functional and they only do it on weekends, or they don't do it during the day. So there'll be a lot of justifying and rationalizing around their addiction if they don't believe that they have a problem. So the first step is always really, really important, and I'll go more into the steps just now, is that they need to admit that they have a problem. They can't control it. It's like if I go out on a Friday night and I just want one drink and I end up having 20, and the next thing I know, it's Monday morning. That is sort of the compulsive loss of control behavior that an addict or an alcoholic would generally, and I say generally because it's not always the case, experience. Some people can be binge users and only use every now and then, but that's where the denial comes in. Because I'm only binging, it's not a problem. But that binging and those binging patterns cause unmanageability and consequences in their lives. Another part of the program is to come to believe in a higher power that can give them strength. And I will go into more detail with this as well. They need to find something that they can turn themselves and their problems over to. What the steps, what the process involves is examining past errors with the help of a sponsor or an experienced member. I'll also go into more detail about that later, but people can't do recovery on their own. And that's why within a treatment process and outside of a treatment process, it's very, very important that they have a fellowship or a community that they can lean on for support in terms of, like, how to deal with life on life's terms, or if they're craving, they've got someone they can phone. And even just listening to other stories and relating to other stories in terms of how they found recovery and they got better. That's the beautiful thing about the fellowship, is that there's always one helping another. They will make amends for their areas later. Oh, excuse me. Later on in their recovery, they will start to make amends for their errors, and I'll go into more detail about that as well. And when we say amends, it's not just walking around and saying I'm sorry, but it's also taking responsibility for the behavior. They learn to live a new life with a new code of behavior. So obviously a lot of the times recovery is involving changed behavior. So the old patterns of behavior would obviously change into healthier patterns of behavior. And it also it involves helping others who suffers from the same alcoholism, addictions, and compulsions. Like I said, if I come home, and I'm just going to use this as an example, I've had a really bad day at work, things have been tough, I come home, I feel like drinking, I feel like using, I go to my mom and I'm like, this is what's going on, and she freaks out and wants to book me into treatment the next day. That's just an example. Because she doesn't understand the situation or the way I'm feeling. Whereas if I went to someone at a meeting or spoke to my sponsor, they would understand what I was going through, and then they'd be able to help guide me through that. So that's why it's so important that, especially even in primary care treatment, that we focus quite a lot on the group therapy, because the group has to be able to share, not only just share and relate to each other, but also call each other out on compulsive or impulsive behaviors. So 12-step methods have been adapted to address a wide range of alcoholism, substance abuse, and dependency problems. There's over 200 self-help organizations, often known as fellowships, with a worldwide membership of millions, now employ 12-step principles for recovery. Narcotics Anonymous was formed by addicts who do not relate to the specifics of alcohol dependency. So any 12-step fellowship that you find these days, and I will get into the different examples when I get to meetings, all employ the 12 steps that were developed in 1939 from Alcoholics Anonymous. So everybody took those 12-step concepts and started to branch out into, say, substance or behavior specific fellowships. So that's why I say this is such a successful way of treating alcoholism and addiction, that a lot of it's branched out into a lot of different areas. In my personal opinion, they should be teaching this stuff in life orientation, and everybody should be able to work a 12-step program in some way or another, because it's very beneficial. And then that brings me to the next point, where demographic preferences related to the addict's drug of choice has also led to the creation of fellowships for process addictions and specific substances. So I'm just going to quickly run through the 12 steps. Because you all hear 12 steps, 12 steps, 12 steps. But what exactly does that mean? So I'm going to just run through the first three. Well, I'm going to run through all 12, but in terms of the first three, this is the three that we specifically focus on in primary care treatment. If your loved one does go, say, into a secondary care facility, they would then continue up until at least step 5. And then in the tertiary facility, like a halfway house, they would need to get a sponsor and work the steps through with a sponsor. So the first three that we generally focus on is that, number 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And this is, like I said, again, step 1's really about breaking through denial, because a lot of people might come into treatment, they won't be willing, They won't believe that they have a problem. You know, and it would have to take them doing a step 1 to actually reach that point of acceptance that, you know, I have no power over alcohol or drugs, and this is controlling my life. And there's always negative consequences associated, excuse me, negative consequences associated with that. Then number 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So we often talk about, and when I get to step work, it's not a religious program, it's a spiritual program. But some people would come into recovery and they'd either be, you know, really resentful, they would not believe in anything, or be atheist. So we just try and teach the clients to kind of become, you know, just come to realize that something greater than them has placed them in the facility at this time with those specific people for a reason. And then the 3rd step is making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. So the book was written in 1939, and they always just referred to God. And the only thing that they ever changed within the big book was those last 4 words, as we understood him. Because obviously as time developed, there was a lot of, you know, more religions and things that came up. And that's why they changed the wording, just so that they could try and include everyone and not just focus on a specific, you know, belief or religion. Go to the next one. Then we get to steps 4, 5, and 6. And this is quite a, I don't want to say long process, but it's an incredibly difficult process for your loved ones to go through. So made a searching and fearless, step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, is where your loved one is going to sit down, write down every single resentment that they have. They're going to write down every single fear, every feeling that they struggle with, their sexual conduct, their relationships. They pretty much look and break down every single aspect of their lives. Obviously, sorry, from steps 4 onwards, you obviously have to have reached a point of like, I'm an addict or alcoholic. And that means that with step 4, they are breaking down everything. And then number 5, admitted to God, ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrong. So in 1939 and in those early years, they would generally go to a priest, or they would go to a doctor, and they would present their step 4 to this person. These days we do it, generally they'll do it with a sponsor, or if they're in treatment, they might do it with the counselor. But it's just basically saying, like, this is what I've done wrong, this is my behavior, and this is what I need to fix. There's quite a nice analogy in terms of step 4 and 5. It's like if you're running a jam shop and you're selling jam, you've always got to take an inventory on your stock. You've got to see what items have expired, what items are damaged, how much items have been sold, what you need to replace. So basically your step 4 is going through that inventory, looking at your expired items, looking at items that are damaged and need to be repaired, looking at what they've sold and what they've let go of, and then obviously and then step 5 is replacing that with new things. And then when they do their step 5, then it basically filters on into step 6, where it says we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And as you do your step 5, you're going to start picking up the defects. It's things like being judgmental, controlling, entitlement, impatient. There's a very long list of defects. I'm not going to go through all of them now. But that's the beauty of doing a step 4 and 5, is you can start to identify the patterns of your behavior and the defects of character that you may be experiencing. Then step 7, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings, is where you start to hand these defects and things over to a higher power of your understanding. I always believe that you can never truly get rid of all your defects, but it does allow you to start creating that awareness and working on them and working on letting them go and changing that behavior. Step 8 and 9 is quite difficult for most people. Step 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And step 9 is made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So a lot of the times when we go into a first conjoint, I don't know, some of you have experienced it, some of you have yet to experience one, where we basically hear from the families how the addiction has affected them emotionally, mentally, spiritually, financially, and obviously what their fears are. And a lot of the times when families don't understand the 12 steps, they're sort of expecting an apology. So that's from the family side, but then also from the loved one side, they're like, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. I feel so bad for hurting you. I'm so sorry. I won't, like, I'm working on it. I promise I'll be better. We always encourage clients not to apologize in those first conjoints, because that's why there's a process that they have to follow before they can actually make those amends. Can't make them, like, sorry means nothing, because they'll say sorry a million times and carry on with the behavior. But through working the steps, they can work on the behavior, look at what they need to let go of, and then obviously make the amends wherever necessary and take responsibility for that behavior. Yeah, they can't jump into treatment and on the first day just apologize to everyone and everything. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last three, which is number 10, continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Your loved ones are generally doing that in treatment already anyway. So what they do is we give them a journal that they've got to write in every single night. There's 10 questions that they need to answer, and then obviously do a reflection on their day and how their day has been. So it's questions like, was I dishonest today? Where was I selfish? What did I do to love myself today? And the beauty thing of this is that they can identify patterns of behavior, they can identify things of where they went wrong, and then they can obviously go to their counselor or their sponsor and say, look, I'm really struggling. I've been angry for 6 days. How do I fix this? Then step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. So that's just maintaining contact with their higher powers, whether it's prayer, meditation, walking in the park, whatever works for them. And this is what they should be doing on a daily basis. And then step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. So this is also just a general every day-to-day thing. Once the theory behind it is that once somebody has finished the 12 steps, they need to go and find another addict or alcoholic and start helping them to recover and work through those issues. So yeah, those are the 12 steps in summary. Like I say, in primary care treatment, we really just focus on steps 1, 2, and 3, just to try and break through the denial and start to get them to stop living on self-will. Right, I'm going to quickly run through, then we go into the 5 pillars. So you're often going to hear generally in your second conjoints when your loved ones are explaining to you, their plan for recovery, they're going to say, I'm going to have to follow my 5 pillars. And then families are just like, I don't understand what you're saying. So the first one that we look at, we have meetings and fellowships. I've put some logos in there as well so that you can see on the one side of the screen, we've got AA, NA, and CA. And then on the other side, I've got the Al-Anon and CODA. This is really, really important for your loved ones because it offers connections with other recovering addicts or alcoholics. So we often encourage people, if you go to meetings, you're gonna become friends and like connect to people that are in recovery and sober and are living a good life. And that's why when I do recovery, sustainable recoveries with my clients, I always encourage them to go to as many face-to-face meetings as possible. Because you need that connection and you need to share and you need to be able to relate to others and their stories. So a lot of the times the meetings, there'll be a speaker that will obviously maybe share their experience or talk about a topic, talk about what they're struggling with, and it allows your family members to, relate to them and to understand, that they're not alone. We do sometimes encourage that we get closed and open meetings. So we do encourage that sometimes, especially for families that are new to a 12-step fellowship, go to 1 or 2 of these meetings, have a look at how they work, see how they function, meet the people that your loved one is interacting with, just to kind of get a feel for what the 12-step fellowship is. There's always a big saying in the therapeutic value of one addict helping another. Psychiatry, psychologists, doctors, that's all great, but it's very difficult if they don't understand addiction. And as far as I'm aware, in Johannesburg, there's not many of the psychiatrists and doctors that do understand addiction, and it becomes difficult for them to treat someone who's an addict or alcoholic. The best way to do that is to learn from another recovering addict. They can't do recovery by themselves. a lot of patients have tried, and they haven't been able to stop on their own. They'll stop for a substantial amount of time, but that will be as far as it goes, and then they'll relapse and continue the behavior all over again. Also allows for the development of meaningful relationships. So, like, for example, they'd have to develop a relationship with their sponsor, not romantic, just like a deep, like, trusting relationship with their sponsor. And then obviously with other members within the fellowship. Fellowships often have a lot of things that they go on. There's conventions, there's rallies, there's comedy nights, there's soccer days. They have a whole lot of functions and events that they would hold throughout the year. And it's always encouraging for your loved ones to attend those functions, socialize, fellowship, get to meet people from other ends of the country. And that's the beautiful thing. Like, wherever you go, you will never be alone again. There's always meetings. And then, as I mentioned, there's face-to-face and online meetings. During COVID, I think addicts and alcoholics were very privileged in the fact that they had access to meetings, because obviously physically they couldn't go to any meetings. So, and that was great because we could actually interact with people all over the world. We could speak to people, from our hometown, and it was really, really good, and it served its purpose during that time. And even now it serves its purpose. Like, if you or your loved one live in a remote area where there's not access to many face-to-face meetings, it's really good for them to then attend online meetings. But I always encourage the face-to-face ones, as there's a lot more connection that happen with those. Then we have obviously different fellowships available, which were derived from the original AA program. The three most common are, AA, NA, and CA. And then we have fellowships that are in this country. We've got Gamblers Anonymous. We've got Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. We've got Codependents Anonymous, which is on there is a logo there, but that's also can be used for the families. There's Overeaters Anonymous. There's Eating Disorders Anonymous. There's a whole bunch of different anonymous meetings that specifically focus on a specific issue. So, for example, if I'm a sex addict and I go to an AA meeting, I might not get anything out of that because it's not what I'm struggling with. So what we often suggest is, when your loved one gets out of treatment, to attend 90 meetings in 90 days, which is a meeting every single day for 90 days. I'm always a firm believer of there's no excuse not to do that this time around, because if you can't physically get to a meeting, there's always access to an online meeting that you can attend. So there shouldn't really be an excuse for your loved one not to be able to attend a meeting every day for 90 days. And that just gets them past that 3-month mark of recovery, which then further increases their chances of maintaining a solid recovery. And then I said there are fellowships available for families. I think the three that I usually recommend, there's Al-Anon, there's CODA, which is the Codependents Anonymous, and then there's also Tough Love groups that you can attend. It's very important, because if your loved one is in treatment and getting the help that they need, you also need your own healing and learn. That's why these family groups are so important. And then maybe look at going into an Al-Anon or a CODA meeting that might be beneficial for you. Then I'm going to talk about a sponsorship. So how this generally works, it's not someone that you pay. It's not someone that pays for you to be in rehab. It's it's a person that's within the fellowship that can help the newcomer to navigate life on life's terms, and can be called when the newcomer is craving. So a sponsor essentially is a mentor. They have completed a round of steps. They've been in recovery for at least minimum of 1 to 2 years, and they are working their own program. So the sponsor should have their own sponsor. They should be doing meetings. They should be doing their own step work. They should be having a service position at a meeting. They should be connecting with a higher power. They should have completed a round of steps at least. And then we have the general recommendations that come in, is that they must be the same sex, preferably. This is just to prevent, anyone falling in love or anyone being taken advantage of, if it's financially or emotionally. I know it's a bit tricky these days because there's a lot of different sexual preferences, but generally you want to try and keep them the same. And obviously they cannot charge someone for their services. NA gives to people freely, or AA gives away everything freely, and that the sponsor that gets that knowledge should be able to pass it on freely. They should not be charging. They should not be charging you for services. So that's essentially what the sponsor does. And like I say, I mean, if I have a fight with my father now, who's just walked in on me without notification, and I get very upset and frustrated, and I lash out and I scream back, I can then phone my sponsor and say, I've just had a huge argument with my dad. I don't know how, I think I reacted the wrong way. How can I fix this? So a sponsor is a really nice tool to be used, in terms of for any situation, and not just to phone when you are craving. Then we'll look at service. So service is not volunteering at like an SPCA. It's not doing work at an orphanage or in a church. That's service that they can do with outside the fellowship. But within the fellowship, we say that service is really important and it keeps you clean and sober. And the reason I say that is because the newcomer, it holds the newcomer accountable. So I'm new, I've got a, say, a key ring position at a meeting. I have to go every week so that I can hand out the key tags. What we essentially develop is something called a home group. So once your loved one does 90 meetings in 90 days, they're going to find a meeting or two meetings that they really, really connect with and that they really enjoy going to, and then they'll go and ask for a service position. And there's always a lot of different positions available. So on group service level, we have stuff like doing the tea and coffee, setting up the chairs, meet and greets, selling literature, handing out the clean time key tags, taking in the money, because every group needs donations to keep themselves running. So there's a lot of little service positions. There's a group service representative that would take any grievances or problems through to area. And that's basically how it essentially works on a group service level. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the next two, which is the area regional service, and then there's national, international levels. So they can, if they're really committed, they can go quite far down, the food chain, where they might one day attend a service workshop or something at World Service. So they'll go, I think usually World Service is usually held in the States. And they go and represent South Africa, and this is what we do in South Africa as a whole. So I'm not going to get too much into detail. There are a couple of other external service positions, such as phone line. So if I'm new off the streets and I want to get to a meeting to get help, there's a helpline number that I can phone, and then there's obviously people on that end of that phone that can guide me into where the areas are in my meeting. The meetings are in my area. Then we have H&I, which we call hospitals and institutions. So those are people that would go to the prisons, they'll go to other rehabs, they'll go to psychiatric facilities and actually run meetings and carry the message in those facilities. I always say that if someone really wants to humble themselves, they need to go and do prison service. That is very humbling experience. And it's always very interesting. And then there's things like fellowship development, where, especially, which is great in this country, where we can push recovery into underdeveloped areas or townships, where there's a lot of lack of education in terms of recovery and addiction. So it's quite nice for us, especially in this country, to branch out and try and keep the fellowship running in different areas. Then there's public relations, like advertising NA. A lot of times you might see a post, like an NA or AA poster up in a hospital or in a police office. So those are the people that run behind public relations. And then there's convention committees. So there's a lot of ways that your loved ones can get involved within the fellowship, and try to obviously do as much as they can. And this just kind of keeps them accountable, keeps them to work, work on their program, and it just helps keeping them go to meetings. So that is what we mean when we talk about service. Higher power, I've pretty much explained, that as we understood him, was the only thing added into the AA Big Book. We always say it's a spiritual program, not a religious one. If you are religious, then that's great, because at least then you've got a connection to some higher power. If your loved one is struggling with a higher power concept, doesn't understand what it is, doesn't know what it is, they can identify this in their steps 2 and 3, which is kind of the spiritual aspect of part of the program, where, they can move forward and obviously work on developing a relationship with a higher power of their own understanding. They need to have something that's greater than them that they can surrender their will over and hand over to, whether it's the meetings, whether it's their counselor, whether it's the tree. If it's God, great. If it's Buddha, great. They've just got to find something that works for them so that they can obviously make a connection and develop that, and obviously be able to understand that there's something looking out for me. They should, well, as I said, can connect with every day. They should be connecting with their higher power every day. And then we often hear the term self-will versus God's will. And this is a lot of stuff we try to practice in primary care treatment, where, and I always like to say that self-will landed you up in rehab, God's will landed you up in recovery. Because often running on self-will and trying to control everything and trying to make sure everything is perfect and fix expectations is never going to work. And unfortunately, it's going to lead to further unmanageability. But if you're trusting in God, or you're trusting in a higher power of your own understanding, and you're able to kind of trust that they have what's best for you in mind, then the program will work its way. You'll be running life on God's will. So that's what we look at when we talk about a higher power. And then lastly, we have step work. Some of your loved ones are going to say they hate it, but it's because it really forces you to look at yourself and your behavior that you need to change. I've indicated or ran through briefly what the 12 steps were. But the beautiful thing about step work is it helps to create awareness of behaviors and character defects, and it allows for personal responsibility. So while your loved one is going through the step work, they're going to start identifying their patterns of behavior, and they're going to start looking at what to change, and they're going to start taking responsibility for their actions and their behavior. Step work is really great for breaking through denial, particularly that step one, as I mentioned previously, where they can identify their powerlessness and unmanageability and actually connect to their consequences. I always say that, well, we always say that we have a disease of forgetfulness, which means that the longer someone stays in recovery and gets clean and sober, if they're not going to meetings and reminding themselves of consequences and looking at their powerlessness, they're going to think, okay, maybe I can have one, it's fine, I've got this under control, and it's not going to work out well. And that's why when you finish a round of 12 steps, you will generally do it again. You might not necessarily do it on drugs and alcohol. You might do it on another behavior that might be coming up in your life. So it's like it becomes like a lifestyle when you start to implement these 12 steps in your life. Then, like I mentioned, we focus generally on steps 1 to 3 in primary care. I've mentioned the amends, where there shouldn't be expectations of apologies when they're in primary care treatment. They have to go through the process of the steps before they can actually start making amends. And then just something nice that Dr. Father Joe Martin says, we look at steps 1 to 3, which is trust in God, steps 4 to 9, which is cleaning house, and then steps 10 to 12 is helping others. So yeah, that's pretty much the summarized version of the 12-step fellowship. So yeah, I think we'll open for questions and answers. And then also, I'm not sure if Cheryl or Calvin would like to maybe add something.
Sure, Dom. I'm just going to start with a question from Trevor. If a loved one comes out of treatment, are there online meetings and with a sponsor?
Yes. So if your loved ones kind of come out of treatment, like I mentioned, we would previously, I would prefer them to go to as many face-to-face meetings as possible. Online meetings are always accessible. There's generally a meeting on the hour every hour, and then they have to get a sponsor. So the best way to do that is to go to a face-to-face meeting, and actually just ask everyone if there is someone that's available to sponsor. Sometimes in primary care, the counselor may say, oh, okay, this person could work for you, and pass on a number, but it's generally your loved one's responsibility to go forward and actually look for a sponsor. I think you guys are also welcome. If you've got anything to share on your experience, you're welcome to unmute yourself and share as well.
Yeah, there's a good question coming in now. Do we get access to available sponsors?
So there is generally a list of names and numbers that does go around at the meetings. I know with Narcotics Anonymous, there's an actual service position called a sponsor coordinator. And that person, so your loved one could go up to that person and say, I need a number. They'd have a whole list of people that are available. But it would be your loved one's responsibility to get access to that.
And I think it's important that we let you know that we, as the family members, you guys, don't get access to sponsors. It's a private, personal journey between two recovering addicts or alcoholics. And if the families get involved, it becomes a bit murky. But also, if a sponsor is willing to deal with a family, then he's probably not as healthy as he or she could be. So we got to keep it separate.
Boundaries are going to be essential here. I mean, I think why we want to illustrate to you guys the 12 steps is to kind of show you the extent of work that goes into recovery. And it's really a lot of work. And we know from experience that some of our loved ones have really pushed the boundaries when challenged. And that's the addiction speaking. The addiction doesn't like to be challenged. And so really their recovery is one of constant challenge. And so it's up to you as the family to support that, sometimes by being as harsh and as challenging as possible, by putting very firm boundaries. And I think what Dom said, for instance, around 90 meetings in 90 days, that's difficult. If you think about, they're only here for 24 days at primary care, for example. That's a third. Now we're asking them to do 3 times the work and try and get through all 12 steps. We're only working on focusing really on the first 3 here. That takes a lot of commitment, and that's hard, and it's frustrating, and they're going to want to give up. And that's where the family really comes in, to lend their support, to lend their ear, but to also give firm boundaries around their recovery, that they must continue with this, that this is really their final hope, that this is your family's final hope. And so, yeah, bit of strictness, bit of support, bit of kindness. It's a lot of work.
And I think also it's your loved one's responsibility to do their own recovery. Like Calvin's saying, you guys can be supportive and you can, kind of let them know that there's an ear to lean on if they're struggling, but they got to take that responsibility and get their own sponsors and look for that kind of stuff. You as a family would notice though, if they're not working with a sponsor or they're not going to meetings, chances are the old behavioral patterns are going to come up, because they're just going to slip back into their old patterns and their old ways because they aren't working a recovery program. So I hope that makes a bit more sense as well. I think Cheryl can possibly give more information on this, but like, for example, if you go to Tough Love or Codependence Anonymous or Al-Anon, you would essentially work sort of your own program in terms of setting boundaries and how to, deal with a certain situation. And that's why we stress like family support is really, really good for the families, just to also be able to kind of work on yourselves in your own recovery process and how to set those boundaries with your loved one.